It brings me great pleasure to actually introduce Matt Slater here, Dr. Matt Slater. He is the John Howard Harris Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Department at Bucknell University. He received his PhD in philosophy from Columbia University in 2006. And he began his career just the other side of the state border at the University of Idaho. His research primarily focuses on the philosophy of science, the philosophy of biology, the public understanding of science, and science communication. He's already written a lot, and he's finishing 2 books on scientific classification, and he is in the research phase for a book aimed at a general readership on the public trust of science. That's what Cornell Clayton, who usually runs this series, that's what he typed up for me to say. I've known Matt for about 13 years now, when he was a freshly minted PhD student, or rather freshly minted PhD, and I was still a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And over the years, he has acted as a kind mentor, a good friend, and he has, much to my dismay, changed my mind about the importance of natural kinds. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Matt Slater, and he's going to be presenting the talk. It's complicated, talking about climate change. I preferred his other title, but we'll go with this one.
Thanks so much for being here. I acknowledge we're starting a little bit late, so understand if you need to leave or something else. I won't be offended. If you would like me to feel offended, you can just like flip your chair over or something. Make it obvious. My initial title, which I was told was just a little bit too long, was Against Silver Bullets in Climate Change Communication, so you can kind of have that in the back of your mind about what I'm going to be speaking about. So let's just start with some public opinion about climate change. I take it that this is fairly familiar. You might not have seen sort of the latest survey data. A lot of this, I encourage you, if you haven't been to the Yale program on Climate Change Communications website, the YPCCC, they have a lot of different resources, a lot of different reports, interactive maps, and other kinds of tools. So it's a great resource. And one of the things we see is that this is kind of a flat trajectory of public opinion, right? So this is the number of people, the green is the number, teal, whatever that is, a number of people who think global warming is happening. So, right, just it's happening, okay? And obviously the bottom is it's not happening. And you can see, I mean, it was 71% of Americans, American adults in 2009. And it's just barely ticked a little bit above that today, right? If we look instead at the people who think that it's mostly caused by human activities, that it's anthropogenic, in other words, that number obviously ticks down, right? So some people are prepared to say, well, it's happening, but I don't know, maybe it's some kind of cycle, some kind of natural process. Right, so that's a little frustrating and depressing. If you look at the maps, here's their map by county, and you can see the level of agreement is rather low throughout a lot of the country, right? And this is despite, of course, us knowing in some sense, or us being informed in some sense by scientists since the late 80s. The greenhouse effect itself was known for 100 years earlier than that, right? So one natural question is, why is this, right? What is causing the delay? Why is this such a frustrating, slow-moving target? And there are a few different explanations we could offer for this. One is that perhaps this is just part of a general phenomenon, right? Some kind of, we see, after all, a lot of discrepancy on a number of different topics between the opinions of U.S. adults and scientists, right? So genetically modified foods being safe, favoring the use of animals in research. So obviously these are not purely factual claims. These are building in some values. You'll notice they're claims about policy perhaps, right? And of course climate changes. Can I use my mouse? You can see that? Yeah. Yeah, so climate changes. Here, you've got a large gap there. This was as of 2015. I think the survey was 2014, right? So, that's an interesting data point, right? Perhaps this is an after effect of the so-called death of expertise, right? That's been a big talking point. Another big talking point has been this idea that perhaps there's a war on science of some kind, right? And climate change is maybe one of the more active fronts in that war. Finally, we have the suggestion that this is a crisis of scientific illiteracy. Right, we have too many scientifically illiterate people, and so they just are not in a position of understanding the science, and that is what's sort of driving this. I think that the death of expertise, rumors of the death of expertise have been considerably exaggerated, and I think that we've had reason for thinking that for a while now. Here's historian of science Stephen Shapin, who pointed out that no society in the history of the world, perhaps, has ever reposed as much trust as ours in the power of expertise. And the present-day problem, he says, is not a mistrust in scientists, but rather a problem in deciding who the scientific experts really are. More recently, a philosopher of science in Canada at Guelph, Maya Goldenberg, has written a wonderful book on vaccine hesitancy, and she also responds to this kind of contention that we're seeing a death of expertise. And she says that the public vaccine debate, and just as an example that she's focused on, is anything but an expert-free zone. Instead, vaccine controversy is characterized by proliferation of expertise, just as vaccine advocates point to the earned authority of physicians and scientists to pronounce on vaccines. Vaccine skeptics point to their own experts. Right? So, part of this, I think, one sort of further demonstration that expertise is not dead, is another kind of phenomenon that you might be thinking about, which is motivated denialism. So, in other words, using this sort of big tobacco playbook of getting experts to say, climate change isn't really happening, or it's not a big concern. And as Oreskes and Conway, historians of science, pointed out in their 2010 book, Merchants of Doubt, this has been going on for a long time for a lot of different topics, right? And it turns out that one of the surprises of Merchants of Doubt to many of us was that it's literally the same guys, literally guys named Fred, who are sort of at the big pivots in a lot of these campaigns, right? And like I say, this bolsters that analysis of the death of expertise being somewhat overstated. I think what's happening a lot of times with the denialists is that not only is it confusing to tell who is a real expert. I mean, there's a sense in which both Fred Singer and Fred Seitz were real experts. They were literally both rocket scientists. One was a president of Rockefeller University, I believe. One was, the president of the National Academy of Sciences. So they had high positions in science and in government. And so you'd be hard pressed to, as a member of the public, to say what exactly makes these guys not an expert. Moreover, the messages play into our wishful thinking of not wanting this to be a thing that we need to think about. We don't want to have to change our lifestyles. So the messages like this, it's not you, it's not CO2, it's the sun. Look at the Earth to scale, right? That's the Earth in comparison to the sun. How could it be you, right? When you look at that kind of picture. And the friends of science are saying this, so there's that. Right? All right, so things you already know so far. What I want to focus on for most of my time today is what we can do about this and what we can't. What are some of the suggestions that I think are gaining in popularity that we should be a little bit more skeptical of? So one suggestion is that we need to promote greater trust in science. Right, that is maybe a prime goal for science communication and science education. Great. How do we do that? Right, that's a tough thing. Another tough question, I think, is, and something that's not as frequently acknowledged as tough, is to say what exactly it means to trust science. Right, there are a lot of different understandings of what science is. Right, a lot of different takes. One that I'm rather partial to is to see science as an activity, a certain kind of activity that humans engage in, which suggests that because trust is a relationship between persons, this whole idea of trust of science is a category mistake, right? That is, it's like not even wrong. It's not even false. It'd be like saying Catholicism weighs less than 50 pounds, right? Like what? That's not. You wouldn't say like that's false and mean that it weighs more than 50 pounds. It's just that it doesn't make sense to say at all, right? So that's one like very kind of strong take on this issue. But when we look at the alternatives, right, what else it might mean to trust science, right? We could be talking about, for example, the people, the scientists. Trusting each scientist, perhaps. Well, that's not great either, because obviously there are scientists who fabricate their data, who behave immorally, who are inveterate liars, who are maybe just bad at being scientists, bad at knowing what the truth is. If you ever go to the website, and I suggest you do, Retraction Watch, it's basically a kind of listing of all the papers that have gotten retracted in the scientific literature for various kinds of reasons. So it just doesn't seem like this is going to be tenable to say we need to trust each and every scientist in virtue of them being a scientist, right? What else? Well, we need to be selective, but how? Right? If we just say, well, we need to trust the trustworthy scientists, we haven't really explained a whole lot. And we again run into that problem of discerning the real experts from the fake experts, or the experts whose expertise is maybe not appropriately relevant. Right? Here's Fred Singer with his sort of competitor report, the NIPCC, rather than the IPCC report, which, as the documentary Merchants of Doubt is a book and also a very terrific documentary. And they kind of go through page by page and note how similar it looks, even in the formatting, in the fonts, in the layout, to the JP article. So that is tricky. Motivated reason, it gets worse. I'm gonna save my good news, such as it is, for the end. It gets worse because experimental explorations of the way people assess expertise shows that motivated reasoning seems to play a big role here too. Here's an experiment that Dan Kahan and his colleagues performed in 2013. Basically works like this. You give your subjects, thousands of people done on an online platform perhaps, kind of a little mini bio of some fictional expert or potential expert. Here's his education, here's his position, various memberships. And you attribute to this person two different statements. We randomly divide the population. Half of them we give the high-risk statement. This is not exactly the statement that they use, but it's a kind of a rough and ready summary, which is basically global warming is of high risk, it's human caused, and so on. And then we also have a low-risk statement. It's premature to conclude that CO2 emissions cause global warming, right? And we ask people, what do you think? Is this guy an expert, right? If you break out the responses by political party, you see this, right? Which is essentially, let's see, follow how this works, right? So if I get the high risk statement and I'm a liberal Democrat, I say, yeah, exactly, this guy's an expert. Oh, sorry. I have to go through that whole thing again because I'm not careful with my clicks. If I'm a liberal Democrat and I see the high risk statement, I say, yep, an expert. If I am a conservative, I see the high risk statement, I say, what does this guy know? Right? And vice versa for the low risk statement. So it seems like our conclusions, our prior beliefs are doing a lot of the driving of who we count as an expert in the first place. So it's not that we can just sort of say, all right, who's an expert, and now I'm going to just take on their view of what's happening. I'm going to take my preconceived notions of what's happening and decide who the experts are. That's not great. What about scientific literacy? Does that give us a way out? Well, here's a different experiment by Kahan and colleagues, which showed that whereas you might have expected that as scientific comprehension increases, you're more likely to agree with the scientific consensus that that climate change is human caused and of risk. The reality is, this right panel, that we actually see greater polarization. Right? So if you're a conservative, it's less likely that you'll agree with the consensus on climate change the more you know about science, which many regard as quite astonishing. But this result is robust. I mean, I've done survey research myself that has replicated this. Here's a salient alternative, right? Perhaps we should focus on trust of scientific consensus, okay? There are a couple of advantages here we could cite, right? One advantage is that it helps with that kind of expert identification problem, right? Because I don't need to identify individual experts, and thus I can't bring in my motivated cognition to say, you know, oh, you're an expert and you're not, okay? At the same time, we also can maybe understand individual advice kind of washing out, right? If the scientific community has mechanisms for holding that individual vice or, you know, fraud or, you know, people just being sort of a one-off bad actor, you know, I don't need to assess their trustworthiness as an individual, right? And this is a kind of a picture that you get from some of the very important, very famous study of the history of science by Thomas Kuhn, his Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where the picture emerges that there's kind of a harnessing of individual vice and competitiveness to bring about this kind of overall productive end. Some philosophers have sort of picked up on this and talked about Mandevillian intelligence. I don't know if anyone has read Mandeville's Fable of the Bees, right, from 1714. It's kind of a you know, a very interesting picture of how you can harness what Mandeville calls public vice and get some kind of collective virtue. Right? So this is actually a little poem that he published anonymously 10 years earlier. Though every part was full of vice, he had the whole mass of paradise. Right? So perhaps consensus kind of provides us with this alternative. And it also does something else that's useful. It focuses trust on what we might think of as the mature stages of scientific work, rather than the latest thing, like red wine is good for you today and bad for you tomorrow. Just wait longer, it'll be good for you again. Or my favorite, I had a friend who had a regular Facebook post about self-serving dietary science, and you just selectively pick, the stories from nutrition science that supported, beer is a great, way of recovering from your marathon. So I'll skip this quote. I mean, it basically just gives you this idea of the Kuhnian picture being one where you get the vice kind of washing out or being handled in the context of the broader group, right? And this seems to jive with empirical data concerning public views of scientific consensus on climate change, right? I mean, if you think back at those graphs from the YPCCC, there's a pretty significant lack of perceived scientific consensus on climate change, and it's only natural to think that could lead to a low level of belief for climate change. This could be a schema in general that we would expect to see, right? So here's that graph, right? To really get at this, sorry, the previous graph was how many people think it's human cause. So this is the one that says most scientists think global warming is happening. Note that this is even lower than the human causation graph that I showed you. And so what this maybe suggests is a strategy, right? And this is a strategy that's been pursued by a number of labs, which has called this the gateway belief model of climate change communication. I take it like, there are gateway drugs. You take this one drug, and now you start taking harder drugs. I'm not sure I love the metaphor here. Maybe I have it wrong. But the basic idea is that telling people about the scientific consensus about anthropogenic climate change gets them to revise upwards their estimates of the level of that consensus. And once they have a belief about there being a consensus, that serves as a gateway to further beliefs, to the harder drugs, epistemically speaking. It's going to get them to think like, oh, this is a risk. Oh, I need to do something about this, etc. Right. So that suggests a pretty clear communication strategy. just focus on the scientific consensus concerning climate change. And it's a communication strategy that we've seen adopted. I believe the consensusproject.org is now defunct. At least their website didn't work when I tried it the other day. But they would create these sort of infographics like this. 97% of published climate papers agree. Okay. And the media is very, very eager for this to be a thing. Here's an article from The Guardian from back in 2018. They point out numerous social science papers have found that the perceived consensus acts as a gateway belief. Right? Summary is basically as I gave you. But there are a number of concerns, I think, about the gateway belief model that people have started thinking about. I wrote a review paper with my collaborator Ashley Landrum a few years ago where we cited some of the work on this and some of the unclarity about the goals and the methods of the GBM. Some have found some difficulties replicating the model. There are some possibilities of maybe reactance or boomerang effects. That is, when you try this messaging, you can actually get people to decrease their belief in consensus because they're, offended that you're trying, something like that. We also just don't have consensus data for a whole lot of subjects, right? Climate change is pretty unique in this sense. And you can still maybe press a little bit about how old some of that data is, its collection methods, and so on. This is very non-trivial stuff to obtain. It's also, as experimental research has demonstrated, pretty sensitive to low levels of disagreement, right? So it's critical in the gateway belief model experiments that the consensus be presented as 97%. If you were to back that down to say 90 or 80, right, still a pretty strong consensus on an issue, people basically just decline in terms of how significant that is. It basically ceases to be useful at all, right? So that's not necessarily great. You still need, and this is a point that is really simple, but I haven't seen addressed. You still need to have a trustworthy messenger, right? I mean, consensus is not the kind of thing that is directly observable. I can't just sort of look at the scientific community, whatever that would be, and see that there's a consensus. I need someone to tell me that there's a consensus. So I need to trust that person or that entity. And I get back to that problem of individual trust. And so that's tricky. Got to identify those communicators. I want to turn to, for the rest of the time, a more general question about kind of the theoretical underpinnings of this strategy. What is consensus? Right? If you look at the way that some of the advocates of the GBM sort of slide between consensus and agreement, it seems that they just are prepared to treat consensus as agreement. Right? So here's Sandra van der Linden saying, we posit the belief or disbelief in scientific consensus on human-caused climate change plays an important role, yada, yada, yada. More specifically, we posit the perceived scientific agreement as a gateway belief that either supports or undermines other key beliefs in climate change. So they just kind of swap out agreement for consensus in this case, which I think is noteworthy. And note, by the way, in that infographic, it's billed in terms of agreement, right? So, natural question, how much agreement is needed for there to be a consensus? Or does that question even make sense? I mean, should we be thinking of consensus as a certain level of agreement, perhaps, right? What makes agreement or consensus epistemically significant? That is a good source of knowledge, right? Suppose I tell you that a group of people unanimously agrees that something is true, whatever it happens to be, right? Question, does that give you a reason to believe it? I hope your reaction is, I have no idea, right? Because why? You need to know more about this group of people. You need to know how they arrived at this conclusion, right? Did they arrive at it as a result of a robust critical process where multiple views were considered and discussed and evidence was looked at carefully, then it might give you a very good reason to believe that group, right? They might be in a great position to know, and their agreement itself is epistemically significant. It might, on the other hand, just be a matter of peer pressure. It might be like some very influential member of the group has a sort of an axe to grind, and the rest of the group goes along with it, right? If that's the case, then it's not good evidence for that proposition. Okay? I suggest that a lot of us, a lot of the non-scientists, are in roughly this position when it comes to the agreement of scientists, right? What is the significance of their agreement? That's going to depend on what I already know or believe about science, right? So here's a suggestion. We could think of consensus as a kind of a richer, inherently richer concept, something that gets at the special background that goes according to science, that sort of occurs in science, right? It's a robust process of a certain kind, right? Of considering and discussing evidence, possible alternative views, arrived at by a suitably diverse collection of independent epistemic agents, that is, people who are trying to know things, okay? Call that the sophisticated conception of consensus. I think that it's pretty clear that for consensus messaging to work and to be valuable, we need that sophisticated conception, right? Or at least we need the background beliefs about science, if we're just talking in terms of agreement, to lend us to that first interpretation on the previous slide. Okay? So, question, how common is a grasp of this sophisticated conception of consensus in the public? That is a question that my co-authors and I set out to try to answer in a fairly large interview study a few years ago. So I'm going to present kind of very brief kind of top-line results from the study. You could, of course, look up the whole paper. The supplementary material for the paper includes transcripts of every single interview, so you can also look up those and do your own analysis if you want. It's part of open science. So just to summarize, the study was based on 70 semi-structured interviews between September 2018 and December 2019 in 16 different states. Approximately demographically representative, though that proved a little tricky. And it was a semi-structured interview with open-ended questions and kind of contingencies depending on the answers we would get, getting at the mental models of science, the impact of science on people's lives, their view of scientific controversy, their understanding of consensus. And one of the things we did in particular was try to set up the interview so it became clear whether consensus played any role in their trust of science before we mentioned anything about consensus. Okay, so we wanted to sort of see naturalistically if consensus arose as something that was important to them when it came to their trust of science. Okay, and we also made it so that we would try to be able to figure out whether they had the concept of consensus in that sort of richer, more sophisticated version. And the top line takeaway is the majority of people are either unfamiliar or unsure of the concept of scientific consensus. 57% either reported being unfamiliar, like do you know what scientific consensus is? No, I don't, essentially. Or a requested clarification of that concept. The 43% who did report being familiar with consensus were all over the map in terms of what they thought of it, right? Here are some examples. When stuff is approved, isn't stuff approved? Consensus would be when stuff is approved. Other typical examples were like this, how common do you think consensus is? Probably fairly, it's kind of like groupthink. Do you have a sense of how scientific consensus comes about? I think it's what I said before, the more often someone states something as fact, the more apt people are to accept it as fact, whether it is or isn't. Okay? These are not going to be people for whom the existence of consensus is going to move them very much. It's not going to be very weighty or meaningful, I don't think. So an obvious alternative would be to talk instead, sorry, that went really fast, to talk instead about agreement, the degree of agreement. And this is also experimentally a lot more tractable because I I can have people do a little slider question even, like where do you think the level of consensus is, where do you think the level of agreement is on this question. They can slide, from 0 to 100%. So what I think this gives us here is a kind of a dilemma for consensus messaging strategies. We can either communicate by calling it consensus, in which case we risk confusion, non-recognition, it just not moving people because they have a completely different understanding of what consensus is, or we can call it agreement, and this is pretty much what people have opted for. But we're overly simplifying quite a bit as the example of a sort of an arbitrary, the certain group of people agree that X, do you believe that X, sort of demonstrates, right? Not only is it not available in all subjects, it, I think, risks losing credibility just because of its lack of conceptual tie to what we ought to believe the truth is, okay? And as a conclusion, consensus messaging strategies are either going to be ineffective or ill-advised, maybe even morally wrong, in our current messaging environment, okay? Now, I have 3 minutes by my clock to give you the good news. That's usually how these things go in a talk on climate change. So I'm going to throw out a couple of suggestions. Maybe we can go back to some of these in Q&A if you want. One thing I think we need to do is ask much more carefully what we want out of science literacy. It's noteworthy when we examine the scale that was used for science comprehension in that aforementioned study by Gahan, that the questions used to measure science comprehension are all to do with matters of particular scientific fact. They're questions like lasers work by focusing light, the Earth rotates around the sun rather than the opposite. Things like this, right? So do you know some basic facts about the world? Okay? Those have nothing at all to do with whether science as an activity is a good generator of fact. It has nothing at all to do whether scientific communities, when they agree in certain situations, should be trusted, right? You're just not getting at anything that's relevant to trust of science when you're asking this. So, is there a conception of scientific literacy that would do better at that? Could we teach people more about science as a messy, value-laden activity that is governed by various kinds of norms and incentive structures and so on, that could make a difference in how they perceive a scientific agreement. Right? Could understanding how consensus comes about be part of that? I think scientists can contribute to this, and this is one of the major subjects of my upcoming book, contribute to this via their own communication efforts. Also by what they don't do, right? I think a lot of times scientists feel incentivized to, they're called up by a journalist because the university put out a press release about a new paper they put out. It's very exciting. Academics are rarely called up by journalists, most of us. And so we say, let me tell you about my study. This is great. The result is science journalism looks quite individualistic, right? It looks quite, a kind of a heroic tale of this is the story of how I found this out. And that, I think, goes against the image of science that we need to convey a little bit. This is a conclusion I discuss in a recent paper, Trust of Science as a Public Collective Good. Better communication, we can all do better at avoiding self-defeating strategies like pushing the problem is with you narrative, clinging to silver bullets for climate communication. I think the journalistic enterprise needs to do a lot better on how they communicate science. Again, it's, do we present it as an individualistic activity, a heroic activity at times, or do we present it as something that's an ongoing process? So this paper, that's my timer going off. This paper is about a content analysis study basically showing that most of the prestige press indulges in this sort of individualistic reporting. And finally, and this is a huge topic, a whole other book, just better approaches to science, right? The scientific community needs to deserve our trust if we're to give it to them. And it's not clear that it univocally does at the moment. And I think it could do better at embracing open science practices and talking about these and talking about retraction and talking about the problems in science and how the scientific community itself is trying to address those problems. And so with that, I thank you very much for your attention. You can find links to these papers if you're interested on my website. These are the references, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thanks.
Do you want to field, Matt?
I'm happy to field them. Shall I ask for a student first? I'm guessing you're not a student, but go ahead.
Thank you. It's very brief. You do not talk about the humanities. Almost all the work and the papers are individually signed. And the scientific work very, very often has got multiple authors with a single one picked out, but even then, could you talk about why, where you don't address the fact that so many of these papers are really multiple?
I don't think that's especially significant, actually. So the collective level of science that we are getting at with scientific consensus, I think, is not the level of there are multiple authors on a single paper, right? I think that's effectively still an individual contribution to the scientific literature, right? I think the value of the collective comes in when authors or other labs or individuals are looking at this paper and saying, "Oh, I don't know. Let's try replicating to see how this goes. What about this? What about this other approach?" And building on that, right? It's that kind of internal process of contestation where I think the significance comes out of, not whether there are multiple authors on a given paper. Humanities, by the way, is I think changing too in terms of how frequently we have multiple author papers. I have a lot of multiple author papers. Maybe it means I'm lazy, or I just have a lot of friends or something.
Even though much of the money that supports institutional science really is built around labs, built around multiple researchers. I just bring that up again. The science people talk about is often collective in some way.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, it's worth thinking about for sure. But
thank you.
I haven't yet. So, yeah.
So you talked about science as an activity versus like the scientists as people when it comes to like public trust and that stuff. And I thought that was really interesting. What do you think about like even more like trust in a scientific methodology and like scientific literacy being involved with more of the methodology rather than like science as a concept or like people?
How fine-grained are we talking when we're talking about scientific methodology? You have a particular kind of example in mind?
Well, I've been doing some research with Dr. Goldsby about like 20th century like positivist stuff and then it's like field of science. So I'm kind of thinking about how like the way we practice science has changed and about how my perception of the quality of science would have a lot more to do with how exactly that science was performed and like the methodology behind the science itself and like or the experiment or even just like an idea or a critical analysis rather than like
so it sounds like we're still talking about a fairly high level of analysis, something like Popper's kind of falsification program, right? This is the classic model of how science works. After all, I make a hypothesis, I go out and I test whether the observable consequences of my hypothesis are true. If they're not, I falsify my theory. If they are true, then I've not falsified my theory, is what Popper says. The rest of us might say, like, I've added some level of confirmation for my theory. That turns out to not be super descriptive of how science actually works. And so, the part of the problem is methodologies in science are very kind of layered in their specificity, and it's not clear unless you're going to just list out a bunch of specific kind of recipes for science, as it were, and have us all convinced that these are all good recipes. Your bread will rise when you complete this recipe. It's just not going to be very tenable to find, the kind of the Goldilocks bowl of porridge, where it's like the right level of specificity, like we can transparently see this. So as long as you do this, you're going to be good, right? So I'm a little skeptical that it's going to be very tractable to go about things that way.
What about more just like guiding principles and like a little bit more simplified, like especially for communicating to the public of like what good science looks like versus like less.
Yeah, I mean, one possibility, that's a good question. One possibility would be interpreting guiding principles almost as kind of virtues, or you know, and to a great extent, you know, there's a recent book that has a lot of kind of empirical work behind it by Robert Pennock, a philosopher of science at Michigan State, and John Miller, who's a psychologist at University of Michigan. I forget his title now, but it's all about sort of scientific virtues and the education into science being kind of inculcation into these virtues. And it's a very interesting idea, and I think, who's taken a science class before? Okay. Oh, okay, yeah, well, maybe I should have asked at like what level. So a lot of you will probably have heard in the context of those science classes, you know, the sort of the value of being dispassionate and, you know, being rigorous with your testing and not sort of sweeping data under the rug. These kind of you know, quasi-moral normative claims about science. I mean, perhaps more, as it were, moral education about science and of scientists into really kind of accepting these principles, and you know, showing the rest of us that that's how it worked would be effective. I have some doubts about that, but because I think you're still going to have the bad actors in play, and thus always the possibility of having people say, yeah, how do I know that these people aren't just making something up? Yeah.
From a practical perspective, you're trying to analyze and qualify the 97%. Wouldn't it be much easier just to focus on the 3% that don't agree?
How so?
Well, some of those people will be motivated by different things.
Yeah.
But if you talk about looking at the agreement or consensus in the bulk of scientists who come from multiple different backgrounds, different techniques, different fields, that's going to be a much harder thing to pin down. But if you can perhaps identify that a lot of those people, like Fred Singer and the other Fred Seitz, they were motivated by financial reward, perhaps, that there were reasons to doubt legitimacy.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. I mean, it's going to depend critically, of course, on there being that kind of analysis available, right? The 3%, okay, yeah, they're all on the take, right?
Oh, no, I mean, that was an oversimplification. Obviously, there's identity, there's tribal politics, there's all sorts of other things, religious motivations too. But if you can actually quantify those things and put them into different percentage groups, the idea of people being opposed to the science might actually shrink down to something that we really shouldn't be concerned about.
Yeah, it might, and I'm not aware that anyone has empirically researched that possibility. That would
You're
be
welcome.
Yeah, you can be a co-author. I mean, so the tricky thing about it, just rhetorically, would also be to try to make the asymmetry clear, right? Because look, I mean, a lot of scientists, you know, have their kind of private reasons and their kind of their own priors, and you know, is it really going to be that one side, the deniers, are, you know, very transparently tribally motivated, and the rest of us are not? You know, it's hard to know. I mean, science is messy, and we all have our priors, and we all have our tribal affiliations. It seems like it's, as a communication strategy, it's going to be a little tricky to pull off, potentially. But I do kind of wonder, I mean, I think there has been a greater recognition over time of the sort of the false balance factor, right? The news program with two boxes, here's the pro, here's the con, and people seeing that as inherently biasing the debate. I think people have gotten much more wise to that, and news organizations themselves have changed the way they do things. And I think that is one of the things, that's one of the changes that has made some difference in sort of public perception of scientific agreement on issues like climate change. But yeah, it's interesting to think about sort of playing the other side as well. Right. My suggestion, though, of course, is not that consensus messaging is going to be super effective, at least not in the situation we're in. I'm more thinking about the long term, in a way. I'm thinking about, I'm an optimist in the sense that I'm thinking that we may survive climate change enough to face another crisis, right? And at that point, we are going to need people who understand science in a deeper way, so that we're not just recreating the same kind of crisis of science communication over and over again. So let's just get started on that kind of process now. It's going to take a long time. So someone else, you've got a whole series on climate change. Someone else is going to solve that, that communication problem, I'm hopeful, in this series. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Yep.
It seems to me like the history of science is one where scientific consensus is virtually consistently overturned or
Yeah.
undermined by new discoveries.
This is another
So
problem for consensus. Yeah.
when you're suggesting that scientists should use consensus as a reason or a mechanism for increasing public trust, it's like you're setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah, that's interesting. Though, I mean, if we really embrace that, I mean, this is what philosophers of science call the pessimistic induction, or the pessimistic meta-induction, that, you know, all of science is built on the bones of previous science and the ruins of failed theories. That's true. So the tricky question is, what do we make of that? Should we extract from that fact, and it is a fact, that we should listen to any science whatsoever, no matter how good it is or where it is, because it's always the case that in the history of the world, the best science has so far been overturned, and we're just one more stratum in that archaeological dig of bones, right? It's a really subtle matter, I think, philosophically speaking, to figure out what to say in response to the pessimistic induction. I'm not going to try to take a stab at that here, but yeah, I think you could certainly be worried about that a bit if you were pursuing the gateway belief strategy. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I have trouble with when I've been teaching science for probably close to 40 years,
Yeah.
is the students wanting to know something is either black or white. You know, the concept of variation. You know, the vaccine works 95 times out of 100.
Yeah.
Well, that means it doesn't work? Well, 5 times out of 100 it doesn't.
Yeah.
And you know, that is significant. 95 out of 100 we publish is significant. 90 out of 100 we can't say it's significant.
Yeah.
But yet if I win 51 times out of 100 times in poker at Las Vegas, I'm going to make a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, you know, the range in doubt and probability and conveying that to the public, I think would have a huge impact.
I agree, and I think this is the role that education reform has to play in this story, right? I mean, why are we educating our children, our young adults, in the particular things we're educating them in? Why are we so concerned to talk about, you know, molecular structure or lasers, or, you know, these very black holes, these very kind of relatively abstruse subjects when it comes to our day-to-day lives, rather than really getting a solid understanding of statistics or probabilities of the social enterprise of science, right? Why not focus on those things and having a populace that's prepared to meet news of science, whatever it is, with a critical eye that's prepared to understand sort of the social factors that are propelling science forward, right? I think that's where the next sort of frontier, to my mind, in science education is, and I'd like to see more attention to that very kind of issue. Yeah. Yeah.
So you had the slide with the graph that contrasts was it confidence in climate change between education groups politically? So those who are very well science educated
Yeah,
or
I'll go
had
back to
diverging
it.
opinions?
Yeah.
So that seems to have a quite pessimistic view on science education then, as becoming more of a tool to post hoc rationalize someone's existing conclusion, as opposed to really a meaningful way to solve this problem.
Well, that depends on if we're really thinking that science comprehension should be understood in this sort of fact-based way.
So then I would ask, what was the metric for science comprehension here?
So as I mentioned, it is a series. It's
It's
the
just like basic, like, do you know what we believe to
Is
be
it-
a causal inference?
correct. It's a
Yeah,
multiple
okay.
choice quiz.
Yeah, okay.
Essentially, it's the NSF science indicators with a few cognitive reflection tasks that that Kahan and all added in. Something like the bat and ball problem, if you're familiar with that, the lily pad problem. These kind of problems that are actually like very easy math problems if you just take a minute to think about them, but most people will answer them wrong.
But it's very much like an applied skills, not so much like a theory of science.
There's maybe one or two questions that have something to do, that is a question about essentially randomized controlled trials.
Okay, and so when you would advocate, or when one would advocate for changing science
Yeah.
education, it would be in shifting from the specific fact base to methodological learning.
Which is still fact-based in a certain way, of course,
Right.
right? So it would be facts about how the scientific enterprise works. So I've actually done other work on this. Some of my colleagues and I developed a measurement tool to use as an alternative to something like this. This is the Ordinary Science Intelligence Scale, which is being used. So ours is called the SESI, the Social Enterprise of Science Index.
Does the trend change?
Sorry?
Does the trend change with a new metric?
It does.
Okay.
It does. We need to get some bigger data sets on this to really see, but our pilot data is pretty encouraging as far as you actually still see a bit of the divergence, but it's almost like this graph is tilted up,
Okay.
right? So you see you see basically the liberals going up more quickly than the conservatives, but the conservatives still go up.
Okay.
So, this is still, we need to vet this further and to dot all our I's and, the I's have the dots and cross all our T's. Sometimes I say it the wrong way and it gets embarrassing. But yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that is one of the reasons why we created the scale, so that we could test this idea of whether it is the case that the more people understood about this kind of this aspect of science, the better they would be receptive to the scientific messaging of a certain kind. Other questions?
Anybody else? We have time for at least one more question. If not, I'll ask my question. As a philosopher of science, I know you don't want to self-promote, but it sounds a lot like what
Have
we
you noticed
need.
how much self-promotion I've done in this stuff?
Exactly.
Go back to my references.
Irony. It looks like one thing that might be a part of social science, science education reform would be a better understanding of philosophy of science.
Yeah.
And it seems right now that what we're looking at is, you say you have some preliminary results that the thing tilts, but it doesn't actually decrease the gap. And
Yeah.
what's the chance that once we do start educating people more on the social enterprise, do you have any worries that it'll actually,
Yeah.
because I have my scientist friends here who are saying, I don't want science politicized. And
Yeah.
what that's gonna do is it's gonna politicize science.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's actually one of the things I'm thinking needs to be a part of the next book. I mean, I have friends who used to work in the restaurant industry who no longer eat in restaurants. Or at least they don't eat in restaurants very often. So they're like, I know too much of what happens in the restaurant kitchen. I'm like, oh, good God, okay. I mean, sometimes when you see how the sausage is made, you don't want to eat the sausage anymore. And if revealing the messy underbelly of science is, with all of its internal politicization, with all of its messy values and contestations, if that sours people on, this is kind of back to your point in a sort of deeper way almost, like, oh gosh, this is really ugly at times. How can this be a way of arriving at the truth? We would have to make sense of that Mandevillian thought that out of vice comes collective virtue. But this is one of the reasons why I think that, you know, the scientific community needs to really work to earn our public trust, if trust is the right goal, because they need to think about the incentive structures for science as a discipline and whether they're achieving what we want them to achieve. Maybe they're a kind of a vestige of an earlier time when society did not need to rely on science to the extent that we do now. So yeah, I think it's a good question. I don't have a firm answer for you.
All right. Thank you for, let's all thank Matt for